Well, hello, good evening, and how lovely to be here. I'm absolutely thrilled. I've never been here before. I want to talk about the relation between reading and writing. I'm getting somewhat towards the end of both a writing life and a reading life, and that's made me realize the way in which the two have been inextricably linked, how reading has prompted writing. So I want to do a sort of whistle-stop tour of this about the way in which books beget books. There's a sort of standard question that all writers, or certainly all novelists, are always asked, which is, where do you get your ideas from? And my sort of short answer would be from life as lived, but also very much from books, which, when I used to write for children, was an answer that used to completely exasperate children because they immediately thought of plagiarism, and cribbing. And of course, what I meant is the way in which your interests, your obsessions, your entire intellectual life is prompted by books, which they weren't quite yet knowing. They were reading, but they weren't yet realizing what reading was doing to them. Well, now, at that stage of my life, my sort of early reading was in Egypt. I was born and grew up in Egypt, and I didn't come to England till I was 12. And I didn't go to school. I had a sort of very eccentric childhood of being semi-educated at home, but an education that was based entirely on reading. I had all the kind of standard children's books of the day, kind of early 20th century. And I'd never been to England, so my concept of this country was based entirely on this reading. Beatrix Potter, of course, Alison Utley, that kind of thing. And when I got a bit older, Mary Webb, who none of you may ever have read, but Mary Webb was a writer of the 20s and 30s who wrote of rural English society. And she was the person on which the satire of the author on which the satire of Cold Comfort Farm is based. So when I came to this country at the age of 13, my concept was entirely of this reading matter, so I wouldn't have been at all surprised to find squirrels in pinnies or rabbits in poke bonnets, and a credulous peasantry who behaved oddly when the sookbine flowered and to whom something nasty had happened in the woodshed. So I was slightly shaken when the real English rural society faced me, and was not at all like this in the immediate post-war gloomy years. My favorite reading back then in Egypt had been Arthur Ransom, which to me was wonderfully exotic, esoteric, this world of sort of greenery where it rained all the time, and these extraordinary liberated children splashing about in boats. I was completely immersed, and would then look up at my own mundane world of palm trees and the camel jogging along beyond the garden wall, and amazed at this sort of wonderful other world. The other great favorite was Homer. I have to say, not Homer as such, but Homer by way of Andrew Lang, which is the late 19th century retelling of Homer, Tales from Troy and Greece. And what I loved about this was, of course, I was in there anyway, Penelope, my name. Therefore, it must be something to do with me, the solipsism of the 9-year-old mind. But the problem was that I was in there with the wrong part. Penelope is described as wise and good, which were qualities that did not appeal. And Helen is obviously much more beautiful. So I rather manipulated Homer, as people have always been doing it since long before. I airbrushed the tiresome Helen, and I set up Penelope with Achilles, who was obviously much more glamorous than Ulysses, who's described as red-haired and cunning. And I equipped Achilles with you have to remember that the Libyan campaign this was in the early 1940s, and the Libyan campaign was roaring away in the desert. So I equipped Achilles with a tank and an armored car instead of all this nonsense about chariots and spears. Well, now, this was all apprentice reading, and I won't say that it ever influenced my writing, but I think it turned me into a reader. And by the time I got to England and to a rather dire boarding school, I was a completely committed, obsessive reader, as I think, in fact, many writers are. And the next sort of years, the next 10 years or more, I came very late to writing, I should say. I didn't write anything until I was in my 30s, and it had never occurred to me before I was about 30 or so that I wanted to write or was going to write. So there were sort of voracious reading years then when I was discovering affinities and rejections. This was the time, I mean, I'm talking now about the sort of late 40s and early 50s, and this was when the favoured, the fashionable writers of the day, the sort of cool writers of the day, were the Sitwells, Osbert, Edith, and Sacheverell, and people like Norman Douglas, the kind of writers whose style was florid, who never used one word where 10 would do. And reading this, I discovered that there must be either I was out of sync with the times, or there was something wrong with the times, and found eventually through the public library system what I did want to read. So was reading my way then through 20th century fiction and discovering the sort of writing I wanted, which was the writing with accuracy, concision, and wit, with the proper sense of the word, the absolutely apt use of language. I was also discovering much else. I was discovering that history, I did read history at university, but I read it very badly, got a bad degree. It didn't turn me into a novelist, but it has absolutely determined the kind of novelist that I've become. It formed a mindset, as it were, which I was completely unaware of during the 3 years of in a rather desultory way, reading it. So I was then reading an enormous amount of history, archaeology, anthropology, paleontology. My novels, I'm afraid, have been littered with archaeologists and with historians. I am a not archaeologist. I'm always very interested in thinking about the way in which your life might have gone in a completely different way. More on that perhaps in a minute. But when I was in my second year at university, I read about, this was in the early 1950s, and I read about the discovery of the Temple of Mithras in London, the excavation of the Temple of Mithras by Professor Grimes, a distinguished archaeologist, and that he was using student volunteers on his dig. So I wrote to him and said that I was extremely interested in archaeology and please could I come and help. And he wrote a charming letter back, which I don't have, but I remember it vividly, saying that he was absolutely up to the eyes now in student volunteers and he couldn't use another one, but that if I wanted to pursue this interest in archaeology, I might like to do a diploma in that when I'd finished my degree, in which case get in touch with him and he would suggest somewhere I might go. Well, I never did. I took a different road, the path forked differently. But I always feel that somewhere there's a sort of alter ego who now has arthritic knees from troweling away all her life as an archaeologist. I wanted to investigate that in a book I wrote a few years ago called Making It Up, when I was thinking about that I might have been an archaeologist and wasn't, and thought about the way in which one's life, any of us can look back on our lives and see the way in which they might have gone off in a completely different direction. And so I made up a number of stories of the things that might have happened to me but hadn't, some of which, I have to say, were in different ways influenced definitely by reading matter and the ways in which reading had directed life. Because it made me think a lot about the extraordinary sort of conjunction or conflict between choice and contingency that directs any of our lives. We think we make choices, but we're also at the mercy of contingent events. And at about that time, I've always read popular science with great enthusiasm. I love popular science. And around that time, Stephen Jay Gould brought out his book, Wonderful Life, which is about the Burgess Shale fossils. These are fossils of the Cambrian period. and they're the kind of evolutionary dead ends that came to a full stop, all except for one little slug-like thing that I seem to remember is called Pichea, which is the ancestor of vertebrates and therefore of us. But all these other evolutionary dead ends seem to me a sort of image of the roads not taken. And that very much inspired a novel that I don't think I would have written if I hadn't read that work of Stephen Jay Gould's. It's a novel called Cleopatra's Sister, and the very first line is, Howard Beamish became a paleontologist because of a rise in the interest rate when he was 6 years old. And it's all about the way in which lives are directed by external contingencies. My most recent novel is this novel called How It All Began. And this sprang from the idea of chaos theory. And I hasten to say that I don't understand the physics of chaos theory. It's the proposition in physics that apparently random phenomena have underlying order. A very small perturbation can make things happen differently. It's sometimes called the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon forest and provokes a tornado in Texas. Well, as I say, I don't understand the physics. I have tried to read the sort of central book on it, and I understand bits of it, but not all of it. What I like is the way in which it mirrors our own lives, the analogy with our own lives. And so this book is about what I would sort of call the ripple effect, the way in which something that happens to someone has ripples into the lives of lots of other people. So the book opens with something that happens to an elderly woman, which then affects the lives of people who've never even met her and never will. Great fun to write, great fun to plan, and I did feel a sort of mirroring real life in a strange way. One of my grown-up granddaughters, when she read it, said she found it scary, and I gazed at her in astonishment and said, I don't understand scary. And she said, because it's something I never thought about before. I'd never thought about the way in which your life is completely pushed off into a different direction because of something that happens that you have absolutely no control over. Well, she's right, of course. What I want to emphasize, I think, about in this canter through reading is how, for me, what has been important has been the serendipity of reading, the eclecticism of reading. None of it has been reading in search of inspiration for whatever I'm going to write next. It's all been the sort of reading that I was going to do anyway, just following what I was discovering that I enjoyed, what I wanted. And out of that have come particular sort of preoccupations. One is with the operation of memory, the way in which memory works. And a novel quite a long time ago called Moon Tiger is very much about that. It's about the way in which memory can be both an albatross and a crutch, and also about conflicting evidence. That's something that's preoccupied me in a number of novels, the way in which there's no single evidence about anything that happens, but as many evidences as there are witnesses, as it were. And this, for me, very much mirrors the conflicting evidences of history, the way in which history is not a set of received opinions, but a matter of constant sort of discourse and argument. And I suppose that is the one thing I did emerge from my 3 years at university, having understood and learned. So what, a few seminal books. Way back in the 70s, the great and good W.G. Hoskins, who was a landscape historian, wrote a book called The Making of the English Landscape, which I hope some of you know. And that, for me, was an absolutely seminal book. I was still sort of fairly young when I read it, although it had been out for some time, and I came a bit late to it. But it not only sent me out to tramping the countryside in search of landscape history, of deserted medieval villages and drove roads and so forth, but it also gave me an image that then sort of fed into fiction about the way in which everything happens at once. The way, the landscape, the physical landscape is everything happening at once, the past and present all juxtaposed. And this imagery crept for me into fiction, the way in which in our lives, past and present are all juxtaposed. We live with memory, which is both past, present, and thoughts about the future. fiction, it sounds as though I only read non-fiction. I do read a vast amount of fiction, obviously. And I hesitate to talk about influences because I think most novelists would be wary of saying that they were particularly influenced by anyone else. And for me, it's more that there are a few seminal works of fiction that have taught me what the novel can do, that have shown me what the novel is capable of, its flexibilities. And so I will just give you 3 titles in case you don't know them, but I'm sure you probably do. Henry James, What Maisie Knew, which is one of the cleverest novels I know, because you look at the sort of chicanery and bad behavior of adults through a child's eyes and you understand and she doesn't. William Golding's The Inheritors, which is the saddest book I know. And Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier, which is one of the most complex books I know, because every time you read it, you find another intricacy and cleverness about it. And so those are the books that I go back to again and again when I want to remind myself what the novel at its absolute height can do. And just to close, one last thing. I can't teach creative writing. I have lots of writer friends who do, and I admire them for doing it. Anyone who is, when the young write to me and say, how do I become a writer? The only thing I would say is read and read and read.